mean, like, I was watching an interview with him on Joe Rogan, and he was, like, critiquing some things an independent journalist, Abby Martin, who I like a lot, was saying about him. Yeah. And the Iraq War and stuff like that. And Joe Rogan asked a question where he was like, well, have you seen, like, how much, like, how many civilians are killed by, like, our drone strikes and stuff like that? I wish I looked at the context of that surrounding argument, because I think it was really relevant. But he essentially said, no, I haven't looked at that. And, like, that kind of thing, it just seems to me that he doesn't look at the other side of it. Like, how are we causing these things to occur? He sees it in a vacuum because he's looking at Islam as a religion, as the source of all the problems. Yeah.
Well,
in my mind,
I think you're extrapolating a lot from
I am.
Because,
and let me just
because
be clear,
he said specifically that he didn't know the number. That's what he said. Right. So he's aware that we kill civilians, and he knows that for sure. But he just didn't know the number, and he didn't want to say, oh yeah, it's this percentage. Right. So I think he's completely aware of that. But he was, in that context, he was critiquing her generalization of the Iraq War and saying that we killed 2 million people and how that was a huge overestimate.
Yeah, and those are like the highest possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was
she
also...
picked the far end of the numbers.
And she was just saying a bunch of shit about him. So he was getting maybe a little personally attacked.
But she did
and he
first.
Didn't like
she
that.
did first.
And so I think he was mostly trying to get at the points that he felt she was being unfair.
That's fair.
And so I don't think he was focused on that part of the drone strike. But the overall context of that was the morality of war as it's waged now, and him talking about how there is a certain amount of collateral damage that's incurred in war in general. And saying, like, I don't think he was saying that the drone strikes are morally justified, but he's saying that to think that war could be waged without collateral damage is idealistic, and it's just not going to happen right now.
True, but the numbers in the drone strikes, I mean, I think it's 90% civilians. When the drone report that came out of the Senate, it was like vast majority of the deaths were civilians. And there were videos that came out of our drone strikes where they would strike a target, and then they'd leave, and they'd wait for first responders to show up, and then they'd bomb it again. There were videos of that got leaked. And I mean, it was fucking insane. Like, there's a part of our drone strategy that is a terror campaign. It's not just trying to eliminate the targets as, carefully and as isolated as we can. And this was an argument that, when he got in an argument with Noam Chomsky via email. So they were debating... Yeah, we should talk about this. I think Chomsky was really flippant with him, and it did bother me. But
before you get into that, though, this figure of 90% that you're pulling out was from The Intercept, and it says, nearly 90% of people killed in recent drone strikes in Afghanistan, quote unquote, were not the intended targets of the attacks. So that's what it said. It doesn't that doesn't necessarily say civilians,
but not the intended target.
But not the intended target, which is
a
lot.
Still awful.
But that's also this one report, and there are other reports that are different in terms of the amount of percentage. So we can't necessarily say that it's 90.
If it's even 60%, that's
really high. That's really high. But it's also where this is in the context of people that will specifically use civilians as cover.
That's true.
And so that's something that Sam Harris talks about, where he's like, when you have a situation where one side of the war will use civilians as cover because they know that it will be effective, and the other side wouldn't even think of doing that because they know, one, that it wouldn't even be effective, and two, that it's morally wrong, then you have a huge discrepancy in just the moral values already. And so to equate them moralistically just because we're killing civilians is really wrong.
For sure.
And that was I think that's the problem that Sam Harris has with Noam Chomsky as well, is the moral equivalence problem.
Okay, yeah. So
let's get into that,
So one of the things there was Chomsky was saying that what we did to Iraq was worse than what the...
Sudan. They're talking about Sudan.
Well, they talk about Sudan further in the conversation. But it starts off because Chomsky had, in earlier things, talked about how what we did to Iraq was worse than what happened on 9/11. So that's how the conversation starts, and then they get more specific talking about Sudan and the Clinton administration.
I'll have to get into that email, because what I remember specifically is Sam Harris critiquing Noam Chomsky's book that he wrote after 9/11, specifically the passage where Noam Chomsky says something about Al-Shifa and the bombing of that, and how it was worse than 9/11. So that's
I'm pretty sure that was one of the examples they go into, But I'm fairly certain early on in the conversation they start with talking about the Iraq War being worse than 9/11, according to Chomsky.
All right, so we're back.
Okay, done some quick reading on the emails between Chomsky and Harris,
Which you can find on Sam Harris's website if you're interested in reading
Yes.
more of their exchange.
So I had issues. I mainly came down on Chomsky's side in this discussion in terms of like the morality of it. One of the things Sam Harris brings up over and over in the email exchange is the idea that you can't make a moral equivalency between what we did and what was done on 9/11 or other examples of that kind,
Right.
because our intentions are different. So one of the things he brings up is that if we had perfect weapons, we would not, like weapons that could kill exactly our target and never a civilian, that would be the case. That we would never kill civilians if we had perfect weapons. And that because of this, because our intentions are good, and it is simply the limitations of our weapons and the inability to use these weapons without causing collateral damage, we're not as morally responsible for those deaths because we don't intend to do it. And I think this view again is a problem where I just don't feel like Sam Harris understands the nuance of American geopolitical foreign policy. He assumes always that we have the not always, but he generally assumes that we have the best intentions, and that we're trying not to kill innocents. In all these scenarios, we're always taking that into account. And I just don't think that is at all the case. I mean, whether it's the invasion of Iraq, or the amount of non-targets killed by our drone program, or our willingness to put totalitarian dictators in place in exchange of democratic regimes that don't agree with us in Latin America. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, where we are willing to use the most cynical strategy to achieve our ends, and there's tons of collateral damage, and it's not, in my view, that we are trying to our heart, like to our greatest possible exertion to not do that. I don't think that's the case. And yet his argument is based off that. His whole moral argument is based off the fact that our killing of innocent people is inadvertent. It is not our intention, or that we're trying not to do it. I think, at best, we're willing to turn a blind eye to it, and at worst, we actively use it as a weapon. In many, many, many of our foreign policy decisions, since World War II through today. And the idea that we're not morally responsible for the outcome, or not as morally responsible for it because our intentions were better, I think is immoral. I think that's a very immoral position. I think you certainly need to account for intentions, but even if you have the best intentions, if you kill millions of people, you killed millions of people. You should have acted in a more careful way, or chosen not to act if you realized you couldn't contain that, unless the circumstances were so dire, that it really couldn't be warranted not to. And that's why I really don't like that argument. And again, Chomsky is always going to be focused on what have we done, because his whole philosophy is about holding our own country accountable.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, first of all, I'd like to make a distinction. If you grant Sam Harris his assumptions, which I recognize you disagree with,
right.
If you grant those assumptions that we weren't trying to do that,
okay, so assuming we have the best intentions,
yes. Okay. Then what would you say about his moral argument? Do you agree or disagree that you can't draw moral equivalence there anymore?
I agree you can't do a moral equivalence, but I don't even necessarily think that's what Chomsky was doing. I don't think he was saying it's equivalent so much as I think he was trying to say that what we've done is worse because of the scale of damage caused. So even if we do have perfect intentions, if the scale of the damage is so much greater, I still think that makes us morally inferior, even if our intentions are better, because we did not do our due diligence, and take the responsibility for using our power in a way that would cause that much collateral damage. I mean, that's part of the responsibility of utilizing power.
Can we at the very least say that we should apologize for the civilian deaths? Be like, that wasn't what we wanted to do. That was a bad thing that we had to do, but I felt like we had to do that.
or some kind of reparation.
Yeah,
You know?
something like that, you know? That's I can't say that it's like, oh, well, our intentions were good, and so that makes it so that it's okay. You know
I mean,
what
the argument really gets down to, intentions versus outcome. And I think even if your intentions are perfect, the outcome is still, in my view, more important. I mean, it certainly, they're both important.
Yeah.
But, perfect intentions, there's still dead people. And you can justify it.
I don't agree that it's more important, though. Because if you intend to kill millions of people, and you do, then that's way worse than accidentally killing them, in my mind. So, I like what Sam Harris says in this regard, because he says intentions are important insofar as they tell you what a person is likely to do in the future. Right. So, if you intend to kill millions of people, and you successfully do that, you're likely to do it again. But if you don't intend to, and you accidentally do it, your likelihood is much less. And he brings up an example of, a person, like say you have someone in your house who is, helping cook with you, and then they turn around and accidentally stab you, right? That, as compared to somebody on the street who walks up and stabs you and is trying to kill you, the intention tells you a very important thing. What are they likely to do in the meantime? So in the future rather, because the person that stabbed you on the street is going to try to kill you.
I definitely think that's a good point. That being said, another moral principle we have to acknowledge is that power infers responsibility, and therefore the more power you have, the more morally responsible you are for the use of that power. So if we're just wantonly, accidentally destroying millions of lives, because we have that power, we have a higher moral obligation to use it responsibly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing that I also think that Noam Chomsky points out in many of his other talks is just how much we can actually trust the narrative that our government gives us.
Well, you see, we're in another world right now. We're not talking about that yet. I do want to get to that, but
right
now you're talking about the moral.
It does get into the question of intentions. What are the actual intentions?
Yes,
exactly. But we did want to talk about that.
We're talking about it in the perfect case of granting Sam his ideas. Right? Okay. So, and I recognize that it might be weird for people, but just for now, I want to nail down what we think about that, and then we can move on after that. But basically, so in the event that we were right, assuming that we were right, that they had chemical weapons that happened to be at a pharmaceutical plant, that they were pairing those two things. So what then is a real, is a proper response? Maybe I could certainly see a really good argument for bombing the plant in the middle of the night like we did, and then after that, having realized that we stopped giving them the drugs that they need, and would have gotten otherwise. I can definitely see a huge argument for that.
Much better.
And I think that it's reprehensible that we didn't do anything in the face of...
And the lack of addressing the collateral damage sufficiently shows that our intentions are not what we say they are. Because if they were as honest as what we claim, then we would pursue that much more passionately.
I could see that. I don't know that that's necessarily an if-then statement you can make. I think it's that makes more sense.
Right.
But I would say there's a perfectly reasonable scenario where they had great intentions and then they fucked up and they were like, well, I know my intentions speak for themselves. I don't need to be groveling at their feet. But I'm not saying that was the response they should have.
That's like that is the weird high ground that we even started the whole Iraq war on, which is just that we have a high ground, they attacked us first, so we have the high ground of attacking them back.
And then it was like, well, they have WMDs, well, they didn't.
It's just it just seems like I don't think that should be morally advocated for. If someone aggresses you, then then maybe you need to retaliate, but you don't do it wantonly. You do it because you feel like you have to, and
That's in this case with the Al-Shifa bombing. They did bomb an embassy before us, and so it was considered a retaliation attack where we were destroying their chemical weapons plant. That's what it was said to be.
Okay.
And at best, we did not sufficiently address the collateral damage that our actions caused.
So I agree, and I would say that Sam Harris would also grant that point.
Right.
I just think his biggest thing was that it seemed like Noam Chomsky was saying that those were morally equivalent, and he disagrees with that. And I agree with him. Granting his assumptions that it wasn't that we had pure intentions.
Right.
I think that matters. I think that's more important than Noam Chomsky was alluding to. And so that would be my main agreement with Sam Harris in that regard.
And I think he's right to bring up the importance of intentions. And this is going to get into our own personal moral code.
Yeah.
I tend to fall more on the side of, being far more concerned with what we're doing because it's us kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And, the responsibility we have given the power we hold.
I think being more concerned and more responsible for that is different from drawing moral equivalence, though.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree with that completely.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Now, insofar, moving on from the thought experiment, I would say we both agree that intentions are important.
Yeah.
And that
So here
it
we
shouldn't be a moral equivalence.
Yes.
But
at the very least, both outcome and intentions are important.
yes, agreed.
Yes.
And I think Sam Harris grants that as well. Definitely, he agrees that the outcome is important too. Just that the intentions can't be just brushed aside. Now, going into what he actually believes about, the narrative that is put
Yeah,
forth.
he seems to grant that we have good intentions, which is where I immediately get my hackles up, because all my understanding of American history shows that, we, especially in, third world countries, we are more than willing to use the most brutal methods available to accomplish our geopolitical aims.
Definitely.
And, specifically in the Middle East, the atrocities of late have been very alarming.
Well, that's a big thing, is we don't value life over there as much as we value it on our
But that's how empire works. Getting an empire.
That's
But
how
even,
psychology works. You're in group. The people in your group are definitely way higher than the people outside.
Yeah, because it's
your
like
group.
us in Europe is like, if anything happens to either of those two, it's just like crazy, moral, our problems with
Yeah,
it.
they look like us and they sound like us. So.
It's like, oh yeah, we bombed a hospital in Iraq and
Yeah, there is a huge problem with
really
us
give a shit.
Well-
not caring about people who are... The more different they are, the less we care.
What you define as your in-group, that is malleable. You can say, I'm a human, and so I care about human life. Not,
See, yeah.
I'm an American, so I only care about American life.
My
That's a choice
my
that
in-group
you
is
can make.
the common people, the universal human experience.
Yeah.
That's my in-group.
Totally.
My out-group is generally those in concentrated positions of power which seek to control the masses. Yeah, that's
And
my
I do
in-group
think
and out-group.
we do have to admit that it becomes more complex and when it comes into a wartime.
Yeah.
Because then you have to be like, well, this person's attacking me, so I go into a different mode in that time.
Right.
But yeah, I think that there is an ability that we should be able to distinguish between the people who are going to be aggressing against us and the civilians of the, that are kind of just in the area of those aggressors.
Yeah.
So that's why I would say the apology and stuff, that is obviously the...
And I definitely agree with you on the point that the more power we should come with, the more responsibility, right? I mean, that makes sense, and I think we have a tendency to wield it without thinking about that, And
Well, if anything, I think there's also an ideology around the idea of the opposite, which is like, we're the biggest dog on the block, so we can do what we want. Which is saying we have less responsibility because we're more powerful.
Right.
Which is deeply immoral, in my
I disagree
opinion.
with that as well. Yeah, and I do think
That's
that
very much manifested in the whole Trump ideology.
Yeah.
That's the
I
America
think that was
first.
like the high ground that I was talking about
Yeah.
too. It's like,
and I agree that everything that we've done in the Latin American countries and toppling
Mike
governments,
makes
and
right.
all of that kind of stuff is really reprehensible, and most of the time it has been for our own interests and against the interests of the people there, which is fucked up. And we should, a lot of that was done under the guise that we were trying to subvert communism and doing the Cold War. We needed to make sure that they didn't get too many countries and whatever. But it was a lot of hand waving in that. It's like, oh, they're becoming communists. Or,
And it's a lot about strategic or economic interests.
Yeah.
And you can see that very clearly with the overthrow of very democratic governments, whether they're in Latin America or the Middle East, to put in authoritarian dictators as long as they bend to U.S. economic and political interests.
Totally.
Which really, puts the lie to the whole humanitarian notion of our hegemony.
Yeah.
It is an empire. It's about power.
Totally.
It's about, maintaining the status quo. And anything that upsets that, no matter how democratic or good for its people, if it upsets the balance of power we've established, they're the enemy. And destroy them.
I agree. But So I think we're getting away from
Yeah.
talking about Sam Harris, which is fine. Like
But we were talking about the intentions of U.S. power.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the
Said
biggest things too is that if we can make this deduction from like the actions of America, it also comes to question whether Sam has like really
See, and that's-
analyzed that before really siding with America.
That's what bothers me, is like, in him claiming that our intentions are good, it seems to me that's where it starts to get tribalistic to me. It seems he's picked teams, and one team is bad and the other team is good, and that's what I sense from his argumentation in an email exchange like this, is that he has that tribalistic view about it,
Yeah.
which makes me very nervous.
Well, so specifically with the email, again, there's this kind of contextual problem that
Yeah,
he
for
has because he starts off the email exchange mostly just trying to nail down what Chomsky thinks and trying to debate this one point. And Chomsky keeps throwing out all these other things that he wants Sam to address, and Sam's kind of like, well, I need to get this figured out first, but he doesn't ever say that.
Chomsky was
And
not...
so Chomsky is like jumping on that, like, you still haven't answered this, and he's saying a lot of really, like,
Chomsky was not being conducive to it.
no, he
Not
was
at
being
all.
a dick
That's-
in a lot of
yes.
ways. And
Yes.
he was an asshole in a lot of ways. He was like, you
Disappointing.
still haven't said this, and he said a lot of things that, I mean, there gets to one point where Sam's basically like, I urge you to, look at how you're responding here, because I don't think that
This
like
is,
your fans would appreciate
Yeah.
the tone that you're taking with me here. And it's
Well,
very interesting.
I should read those for sure.
It's a good exchange to read for that reason, I think. But anyway, all that is to say that I think it's hard to get a good representation of what Sam Harris really thinks on all this, because he was trying to drill down on this one point. And so I feel like a lot of what he brings up in that is mostly just about that. Like, he's not trying to disseminate his entire view of foreign policy and how the American government has behaved.
Right.
He grants a lot of what Chomsky says, in
Right.
fact, about how reprehensible we've been in the past. And so I think in this particular case, he finds it difficult to believe that Bill Clinton, organized that strike knowing that it would kill that many people and not caring. Like, that just that's just not what he thought happened. And I think it's fair in single cases like that to hold that kind of perspective.
That's fair.
I
But at
think
best
overall-
that means... Go ahead.
Overall, I do think he is critical of how we, throw our power around, and I think he talks about that in other cases, other parts of the book, and so I would say that I think partly what's going on is a misrepresentation of his views, but I would agree that he probably hasn't looked into some of these things as much as maybe would be better if he did,
And I do think an underlying theme in Sam's responses makes me feel like pushing him on his views on American empire and American foreign policy would be good.
I agree.
That's-
that would be awesome. I would love to hear him talk more about that.
That's
And there's
really-
actually some talk of him doing a podcast with Chomsky. Apparently,
Oh, wow.
Chomsky has said something
awesome.
about that. So, like, Sam Harris actually
Oh.
went out and asked, he tried to start this email exchange and it didn't go well, and he basically aborted it. But apparently, Chomsky has said something about maybe being willing to do a podcast with him. And so,
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, that would be sweet.
Be great.
I would be very interested to hear
It'd
that.
be better in person than over.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Way
Because
better.
I think what happened was Chomsky read what Sam wrote about him, got very defensive and flippant, and it just was not conducive to discussion. That's what I think happened.
Yeah, this one email here is from Sam Harris is like, no, I'm hard-pressed to understand the uncharitable attitude, really bordering on contempt, conveyed by almost everything you've written thus far. What is it adding to the discussion? If you want some disinterested feedback, we might pass this exchange along to Lawrence and Joanne, as you suggested below. I believe they will echo my concern and tell you that you are not doing yourself any favors here. Your last email is as strangely prickly as the others. If you haven't written about my work, why not just say so, rather than act like you've sprung a trap on me? I never assumed you had written about me. In fact, I assumed you hadn't. So what is the point of this reciprocation business?
Yeah.
And,
There's a lot of
so
tit for tat.
just goes into that about like how he's just kind of being a dick and he's not sure why. But anyway, so yeah, I would love to see them talk in person and hopefully break down some of these walls that they set up and couldn't get.
Well, it's all